Greetings, everyone. You ready for your last lecture? Here we go. We're going to talk about generalization and maintenance. So let's just get into it. All right. Generalization in a nutshell. Keep in mind that what we're trying to do here is take our interventions, whatever intervention you may have done, and try to get that to generalize to another context. So behavior must occur in relevant environments other than the trained environment. That's the idea with generalization, right? We don't just want the behavior to exist in one particular setting. Let's say you're teaching, I don't know, manners or something like that. So you've got these manners that you're trying to teach. It works. You got the kiddos doing it well in one setting, but you need to make sure that they also follow their manners, so to speak, in all other settings, right? So it's school or grandma's house or whatever the case may be. So that's the idea behind generalization. If we're thinking about, let's say even studying behavior, you can teach a kiddo to study one topic, but does that mean that those skills are going to generalize to another topic? Or you teach them how to behave in one classroom, maybe a fifth grade classroom, but then in a sixth grade classroom, they're still engaging in the same problems that they used to. So, that's a failure of generalization. So those are the types of things that we're trying to address with generalization. Ultimately, the goal with generalization is not to need additional interventions. If you design your intervention correctly, you won't need additional ones. Now, that's in an ideal world, as you might guess. Oftentimes you might have to prompt or something like that. But specifically speaking, which is kind of funny, specifically speaking, generalization is something that you must program for. So we'll deal with that in a bit. The point is that generalization, if we design that program right, generalization is going to be automatic. In other words, it's going to occur, the behavior in question, the one that you want, is going to occur at other times and other places. In order for this to happen, we have to plan for it. You can't just guess that generalization is going to work. You actually have to plan for it, and you have to go through a certain set of procedures to make that sort of thing happen. Another type of generalization is response maintenance. Right? We want that response to maintain past the end of the intervention. You want it to continue, you want it to be present. You don't want it to just go away because you turned off your token economy or something. So that's a good example right there of a situation where response maintenance is necessary. Is that when you put that token economy in place, of course you're going to get the behavior you want. That's the idea with it, and it is going to work. But the question is, when you turn that token economy off, does that behavior stay? Does it maintain, as they say? And does it go beyond that particular setting? So the response persists after the intervention is complete. All right. We got a couple of different types of generalization to talk about. Probably the first one and the easiest one to understand is context generalization. So we're going to train in one setting. We're going to call that the instructional setting. And then we want the behavior to be performed in a different one. So I teach you, this is the examples I was given a little bit ago about, I teach you how to behave in fifth grade, and I want that to continue on until sixth grade. Or I teach you about some study skills, and I want that to generalize to a different environment. In other words, we're generalizing the setting. The setting itself has been generalized. Right? So that's what we're doing with this one. Right? Simulations are a good example of these things. Whoa, let me back up. All right. Simulations are a good way to establish context generalization because that allows you to get all these different contexts in place. It allows you to try different things. If you think about flight training, for example, a large portion of flight training is simulations, whatever that is simulations. The point is that we're going to throw all these different scenarios, different settings, and different situations at you to see if you know how to behave. And then proper training will occur, hopefully, and then when you get out into the real world, and let's say you're flying a plane and then something happens, you've been trained about how to handle that situation. I think the guy's name was Captain Sully, or I can't remember his last name, Sullenberger or something like that. Anyway, the guy that landed the airplane, that's a rough term, landed the airplane in the river back east here a few years ago, right? And nobody died, nobody really got hurt. Everybody was okay. There's a classic example of context generalization. He was engaging in a particular behavior, i.e. trying to fly that airplane and trying to land it in a totally different context, in this case on a river, right? So without all the simulation and without all that program generalization that had occurred throughout his life, there's no way he would have been able to do that. So that was a very successful case of generalization. And you would never expect a new or an unexperienced pilot to be able to do that sort of thing, even when they've been through proper training. They might get close, but there was a lot of skills that came into play there, and I would bet that a large portion of that was generalization. Okay, why is it not switching? Ah, there we go. The other type of generalization is response generalization, right? So we're talking about functionally equivalent behaviors here and doing different equivalent behaviors, right? So if I learn what one behavior works in one setting, and then it may be that there's multiple behaviors that work in that setting, that's the response generalization stuff, right? So these are untrained behaviors, behaviors that you did not program for specifically, yet are emitted, right? So they're untrained yet emitted. That's an example of response generalization. We didn't teach you how to do this one particular thing, but it's the functional equivalent of something we did teach you to do, so therefore you will likely do it. Other cases, let's see, what do we got? Contingency adduction, all right? This is behavior shaped in one set of contingencies, then serves a different function. So, trying to think of a good example here. I could go back and always give a woodworking example, or we could do a science example, right? So think about the courses that you may have had, what do we call it? Research methods courses or something like that. And there's a certain set of skills that are associated with that, that you are learning how to engage in research and how to critically evaluate research and how to apply principles like falsification and empiricism and those types of things to the educational setting, to the research, right, or to doing research. Well, contingency adduction would be where those skills then appear in a whole new context, serving an entire new purpose, right? So think about that critical analysis stuff. You learn to critically analyze research, but then all of a sudden, maybe you learn to critically analyze yourself. You start applying those same principles to your own behavior. And imagine if you walked around, if you had a belief system or something and you try to challenge your belief system, if you took a falsification approach for your belief system, that's a situation of contingency adduction, right? We didn't teach you to do that on purpose. We taught you to analyze research or something like that, but then you're in turn using that for a different function. Okay, there we go. Generalization across subjects. Oh, darn it, moving too fast. So generalization across subjects, where you learn you teach one person one thing, and that generalizes to other people. Maybe there's a lot of reasons why it may generalize, but right off the bat, the one that I tend to think of is maybe some form of imitation or something like that. But generally speaking, this lecture cracks me up because I say generally and specifically a lot, and then in the context of generalization, that just gets rather humorous. Anyway, so generally speaking, we're just talking about a particular skill appearing across multiple people here, even though those aren't the ones that you trained. How do we plan for generalization? Well, right off the bat, it must be programmed. You can't do this stuff, or you can't just hope that it's going to happen. It's got to be something specific, right? The easiest thing to do to program for generalization is to choose a behavior that has a clear natural contingency set for it. And a desirable behavior at that, right? So if we're teaching the kiddos to share, right? There is a natural contingency for sharing, which is that they'll get access to more things than they would have if they didn't share. So if they don't share, then, or let me try this again. So if you teach kiddo A to share something, then chances are through generalization across subjects, or maybe even your training program, that other people are in turn going to share with that kiddo. So they're going to have access to more things. So the natural contingency there is the access to more stuff, or even the good feeling that results from helping somebody else or something like that, right? Or sharing with whoever it may be. So when we choose a behavior that meets that natural contingency, it makes it highly likely that generalization is actually going to occur. So then we go to that new setting, right? So we've got our training environment, and we're training a particular behavior, such as sharing, and it's contrived, right? We've set that up. We're forcing the person to share, and then providing some sort of reinforcer for it. But then we get out in that new setting, and hopefully with any luck, right, they're going to come into contact with that natural reinforcer. So the new setting literally automatically maintains the behavior that you had just spent time trying to train. right? And that is a successful case of generalization. You did well at programming because the natural reinforcers are there. It gets even better if you get that natural reinforcer in place in the original environment too. So sure, we can switch immediately from a contrived situation to a new situation where the natural reinforcer is going to come into contact with the behavior and it's going to maintain. Or we can take that contrived situation, fade it out, turn it into a natural reinforcing situation in the original context, then go to a new context, and bingo, off you go. The natural reinforcers are already present. So the key here again is making sure that you connect a behavior with a natural reinforcer, and that you're not just being directive on purpose. You're just not trying to get the kid to do something that you want. There's a reason why you're getting them to do stuff, and that's to make them more functional and more adaptive to their life, right? Or adapted to their life. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do with all this stuff. Is sure, yeah, we're trying to get behavior under control, but if we do it right, it leads to natural contingencies. So not only must we choose behaviors that meet natural contingencies, we must specify all conditions in which the behavior should and should not occur. In other words, we're trying to establish generalization and discrimination. Right? When do you want this behavior to happen? If you're thinking manners, you want that to happen at any time that you're eating a meal. It doesn't matter if you're with your friends, with your parents, with your grandparents, with whoever. You want that skill to be present in all these environments, except when maybe you're eating wings, you know what I mean? So you're identifying when that behavior should and when it should not occur, right? Now list the changes, be specific. List the changes that need to be made in that behavior in order to meet those criteria. If you don't list them down, how are you going to plan for it? So you have to write them down, you have to be specific about it, and try to build in, and don't forget to build in the access to those natural reinforcers. List those settings where it's required to occur. So what changes do you need to make to the behavior for the successful for the access to the natural reinforcer, and in what settings are you wanting that to happen in? Right. So be specific with all this stuff. All right. Well, how are the little pieces put together here? Teach sufficient examples, and I used the word examples here, but I'm going to say exemplars. Teach sufficient exemplars. In other words, train all possible examples. That sounds like a big task, and it is. Right? So you need to be as clear as possible about what behaviors will work in what settings and when they'll work. And you need to teach all of those things. Train all the possible examples or stimulus exemplars as you possibly can. So again, here we go. Teach sufficient stimulus exemplars. I think I misread that a moment ago. So the stimulus is about the settings, right? So under what conditions do you want the behavior to happen? So you got to set up all those conditions that you can possibly think of. That way you've at least trained all the stimuli, and those stimuli, the connection of those stimuli to behavior. You've trained all those instances. So this is one behavior in multiple settings. So again, you're using those different settings. You're using the skill that you want in the context of a particular stimulus. Right? And then the other side of this coin is teach sufficient response exemplars. Okay? Not just examples, exemplars. Right? Teach multiple responses that will connect with the reinforcer. This is where we start to think about response classes. There's a bunch of different ways to write a paragraph. There's a bunch of different words that you can choose to successfully write that paragraph. So teach a bunch of them. Teach a bunch of different ways to put a paragraph together. The main point doesn't have to go at the beginning of the paragraph. It could come in the middle. It could come at the end. All of those are sufficient responses, right? They're okay. They meet the criteria of a paragraph. So you need to teach all those different instances so that people know what to do. In other words, you're planning for generalization. Show what not to do, and show when not to engage in a particular behavior. So provide negative teaching examples. Now, this is okay in this context, but I do not want you doing this in this context. Right? It may be okay to do something in front of me, but it's not okay to do that in front of somebody else. There's all sorts of things that kids learn that are okay to do in private or okay to do at home, but aren't okay to do at school or in public. And the same thing happens for adults. We learn what we can do and when we can do it. Basically, all you're doing here is setting up stimulus control. You're showing when something is okay and when something isn't okay. So those are the basic criteria. Now, how do you actually go about that? That's a challenge. So you're going to have to think about when you're teaching sufficient stimulus exemplars. Right? Think about all the different stimuli you may want to do. And the same thing with responses. Identify all those responses, list those out. Identify what needs to happen to make those occur. Are they already occurring? Is that behavior happening in multiple settings already? Or is it not? You have to get really detailed with all this stuff in order to be extremely successful with it. Additionally, we want to provide generalization probes. Test to see if that behavior will generalize or if you need to continue to train to teach sufficient exemplars, either in responses or stimuli. Right? So a generalization probe is really straightforward. Just provide a different setting in a controlled environment that you're still managing the behavior in and test. Did the behavior occur here? And if not, you need to make some changes. If it does, you've been successful. Keep on with your plan and making and continuing to make this change plan successful. Make the settings as similar as possible. That seems pretty obvious because the closer the stimuli are together, the settings are together, the more likely it's going to be the more likely the behavior is going to generalize. We can go back to simulations with this one, right? Think about the aircraft simulations. If I'm just sitting here on my laptop and flying a flight simulator with a joystick, that's not anything similar to the real world at all about where I'm going to want that behavior to generalize to. So what could I do to make it more accurate? Well, instead of using a joystick, I could use something like a yoke and rudders. Unless I'm flying some really fancy airplane or a military aircraft or something, chances are I'm not going to be using a joystick in the airplane. It's going to be a yoke, right? For those of you that don't know what they are, they're closer to a steering wheel. And the point is that as I make my training environment closer to the real world environment, then generalization is more likely to happen. And I could even improve on that. And if you start looking at flight simulators, not just the software, but with the context, the environment, it builds up and builds up and builds up, and it gets more and more like that real world. Ultimately, you get to the types of things that the airlines or the military use with regard to simulators, which are, they're impressive multi-million-dollar machines that you climb into this thing and you're actually sitting in the cockpit of a real, 737 or 747 or something like that. And then, or at least as close as possible to a real cockpit. All the switches are the same. Your windows are all the same. What do you see out those windows? Well, those windows are full size. It basically screens. They're monitors. And then when you look out, you look and see what you would really see in the real world, and that's all right. That's not too bad. We're getting close there, to the real world. But then they add in one more level. They add in motion, right, to teach your body what it feels like when you engage in these particular skills and tasks of flying an airplane. And when you start to add all those things in, and you make that environment as similar to the real environment that you want that behavior in to occur in as possible, then your success rate is going to go through the roof. You're going to be more likely to generalize. Right? And this is why there's hundreds, if not thousands, of hours in simulators before people get out there and start doing their ferrying people around the planet. All right. So again, the contrived versus natural stuff. That's what I was just describing. Was that we have this environment and it's very contrived, in the sense that we have this simulator, it's kind of fake, but we ultimately want to get that as close to the natural setting as possible. Right? Use common stimuli to evoke a response. Right? So again, I'm going to stick with the airplane example because for whatever reason it's in my head today. If you have a stall warning in your aircraft and it goes, wah, 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 it sounds like a bad, dead, dying duck or something like that. Well, when if that's in your training environment, I would hope that that's pretty much exactly like the sound that would occur when a stall occurs in a small aircraft or another aircraft. It should be that same sound. If it's not that same sound, then the person isn't going to know what to do right away. They may figure it out, but the time that it takes to figure it out could be problematic, and they may be on their way to having some type of accident. If possible, provide practice in that generalized setting. Get out into that generalized setting and do supervised practice in it. You may or may not have seen this on the bus. Right? Sometimes there's some people on the bus that are going through, they're developmentally delayed or something like that, and they're going through training programs, and they're learning how to use money and how to use the bus system and all this stuff. So what do they do? And after practicing it many times back at the house or the training center, then they go out into the real world and they actually, in a supervised sense, go ride the bus. Okay? And seen this happen a couple of times, and I think it's just awesome because the people are out there, they're learning how to interact with the bus drivers and the other people on the bus, and how to figure out where stops are and things like that, and learning that it's okay to ask people to tell them when a stop is coming and all those things. Right? Let's see what else here. Provide practice in the generalized setting. So the more you get that supervised practice in that setting, the more what you're really doing is providing your training in the environment in which the behavior is going to occur, and that's perfect. That's exactly what we want to do. In order to make this successful, though, you need to get that practice behavior to come in contact with the natural reinforcers that are present in that environment. Without that, then your chances, your success at generalization is going to decrease. The chances that you're going to be successful are going to be smaller. Have other people reinforce the behavior in new settings. They're used to getting, whoever this is that you're working with is probably used to getting reinforced by you. Have somebody else do it. Because this is how things are going to happen in the real world. You never know who's going to deliver the reinforcers. You never know what those reinforcers are going to be. So if you can use other people to do that, to reinforce that particular behavior in new settings, now you're teaching another skill that behavior will be reinforced. It may not be reinforced by the same person every time, but it will ultimately be reinforced. Teach the learner to ask for reinforcement. So this is a sort of a self-management skill where you can teach that person to say, I just did this, and then in a sense prompting somebody else to say, well, good job, right? Kids tend to do this quite naturally, although I don't think it's something they're born with. I think they learn about it. But the idea is that oftentimes kids will come up and say, look at what I did, look at what I did. They're asking for reinforcement, right? Yeah, husbands will do this too, by the way. Husbands will make the biggest deal in the world about taking the trash out. Okay, I don't know why. It's just something that happens with husbands, obviously. And it's like, well, honey, I took the garbage out tonight. Ha ha. And they're getting all excited about it and things like that. It's like, really? All you did was take the garbage out. But still, this species called husband still tends to want to get reinforced for that sort of thing, or even other small stuff. The point is that you can also teach other people to ask for reinforcement for appropriate behavior. Because oftentimes when you're switching from this contrived environment to this natural environment, what you really have here is a very difficult scenario of going from a rich reinforcement setting to a thin one. So if you teach the person how to richen their own reinforcement schedule, then it's going to be more likely for them to succeed. How do we terminate programs? Because that's really what we're talking about here is termination of these things, termination of a token economy or something like that. And of course, it's all going to be about fading. So let's take a look at it. So modify your program. Right? Start to change those antecedents. Right? So there's lots of ways that you can modify programs. But right off the bat, we're going to change the antecedent. So in other words, we're changing that setting, trying to make it more like the real world and less contrived. Right? Modify the behaviors. Specifically, what behaviors does this person need to engage in? Think about the one that I just talked about with regard to teaching somebody to ask for reinforcement. That's a behavior that you can train as part of your program to help them ensure that they're going to get reinforced for the proper behavior in the natural environment. Right? And modify consequences. Remember, we're going to try to change from contrived reinforcers to natural ones. If we're successful, then with making those particular changes, then the behavior should generalize and be pretty much automatic once it gets into the natural environment. And that's the whole point with modifying consequences here, is that we're trying to get that as natural as we can. Again, connect to natural reinforcers. Right? Fade by increasing the effort. Right? This is what we were talking about with, the token economies. Right? So in order to get rid of that token economy, you slowly fade things out. You fade out you fade out the numbers of reinforcers that you're given. In other words, you got to work harder for it. We're going to thin this schedule. Right? And there's always some good examples out there of this type of stuff with kids that they've been on one particular schedule for a while, and all of a sudden you switch that schedule and you make it thinner, and when you do that, the kid might even ask for reinforcement and say, "Hey, I used to get this every time I would do this, or every third time I'd do it. Now I'm only, now you didn't give it to me. What are you going to give it to me?" And the idea is that, hey, you're doing the right thing. You're thinning that schedule. You've already trained them how that behavior functions in that on that one schedule. So now you're going to thin that out and make it more like the real world. All right, and that's about it with all that stuff. So there's a lot more in this book that I really think you need to look at. And one of the things I think is important for everybody to flip through and for your own life, it's the self-management section. And the self-management section really takes all of this stuff and once again connects it to a different context. So it's all the same stuff. It's the generalization, it's the reinforcement, it's the punishment, it's the behavioral contracting, it's the FBAs, it's all those things, but it applies it to yourself. And there's some unique problems with that that I think you guys need to really spend some time looking at. At least it would be useful for you. And short of being a self-help book, that's kind of what the chapter is about anyway, is really learning how to maintain your own behavior and manage your own behavior. And it sounds like it's something simple, but believe it or not, it's a lot more challenging than what one may let on. Even when you have this skill set, it can still know how to implement these different tools. It still is difficult to do this to yourself. It takes a certain amount of self-realization or self-actualization, if you will, to be able to do that. And but there's some basic skills that you should pick up by looking at that are a little different than some of the things we've talked about. Let's see, what else? Oh, the stuff on verbal behavior. There's an entire chapter that we skipped on verbal behavior, and that's a tough chapter. It really changes the way we tend to think about behavior in terms of, like me talking to you right now. How did that behavior come about? How did speaking come about? Is it phylogenic? Is it ontogenic? What's the ontogenic component in the phylogenetic response? There's all sorts of stuff going on there. How do we look at it? Listening, like for example, just to have an interesting read, take a look at what the authors talk about with regard to listening. What is listening and what is communicating? And it's really a different approach than what we've typically been taught, although it uses some of the same skill sets that we've learned before, such as active listening and stuff like that. But it redefines those in things that are observable and very clear, and it basically makes the field scientific. Now, I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of controversy over the verbal behavior stuff, and it's something that hasn't really been, it's been explored to some degree, but it's something that's ripe for more exploration. So if you're interested in verbal behavior, let me know, and maybe I can get you in touch with somebody, or maybe we can even design an experiment to start playing around with it, because I do have some interest in it. And there's some other faculty, either in Spokane or at Cheney, that also have an interest in verbal behavior. So in terms of everything else, I guess there's kind of one of the closing comments here is, be cautious, because having scratched the surface with these tools and you haven't had a lot of supervised practice with these particular tools, and that's okay. You're not going to be behavior analysts out there in the field, but having that basic skill set, basically you have enough information to be a little bit dangerous right now. So be ethical, be cautious with how you implement these things, work with a behavior specialist, and feel free to give this stuff a shot. I'm saying be cautious, but I also want you to go out there and try these things. And keep in mind, like the title of the book, don't shoot the dog. I think that's one of those big lessons that you need to keep in mind as you start to implement these things. If you're trying a token economy and it's not working so well, maybe you should look at the procedures that you're using and whether or not there's some treatment fidelity there. Don't blame the token economy. Blame how it's being implemented. And the same type of thing with reinforcers. If you're reinforcing a particular behavior and the behavior isn't changing, well, guess what? You probably don't have a reinforcer. So there's all sorts of stuff like that you need to keep an eye out for. So just be cautious as you get out there, but don't hesitate to try these things, especially the self-management stuff. Definitely try it on yourself. You might get some great results. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the course. I've had a good time, and I will talk to you all soon.